Look closely at the images in front of you. These are Vietnamese victims directly harmed by the massive amounts of Agent Orange dioxin that the U.S. military sprayed during the war. These are not just emaciated bodies ravaged by cancer or faces frozen by neurological disorders. Here are children born with no chance of ever living a normal life. Bodies fused together, limbs twisted, spines collapsing, mouths that cannot close, eyes clouded as if they were never meant to see daylight. These deformities are not the tragedy of a single day or a single generation. They have persisted for decades, repeating themselves in thousands of families across Vietnam. And then look at another group of faces. U.S. veterans, men who directly participated in or operated near the spraying missions. Many of them now suffer from leukemia, lymphoma, Parkinson's disease, peripheral neuropathy, and other devastating conditions. Some sit permanently in wheelchairs, some cannot even button their own shirts because their hands tremble uncontrollably, some gasp for breath in the middle of the day like men twice their age. Their children, too, bear the burden. Serious birth defects, developmental delays, fragile bodies carrying a toxic legacy they never chose. Yet instead of protection, many American veterans have faced indifference and denial from their own government. Decades of lawsuits, seeking recognition of exposure, medical support, compensation, have been dismissed, stalled, or buried behind cold technical arguments. Men who once fought under their nation's flag are now forced to fight alone to prove they are dying from the very chemical their government ordered them to handle. So what truly happened after those planes released their chemical load? What exactly is Agent Orange, dioxin? What has it done to the Vietnamese people and to American veterans themselves? And why, even now, does the United States continue to evade responsibility, even toward its own soldiers? In 1961, as the United States expanded its military involvement in South Vietnam, it immediately confronted an enemy that fought in unconventional ways. The Vietnam War unfolded largely in dense tropical forests, terrain unfamiliar and extremely challenging for U.S. troops. From the central highlands to the eastern jungles and coastal mangrove swamps, much of the region was covered by thick, interlocking canopy. In many areas, sunlight barely reached the forest floor, and visibility dropped to just a few meters. The dense vegetation restricted armored vehicles, strained logistics, and limited air support. The U.S. military reported not only operational difficulties, but also harsh living conditions. Constant humidity kept clothing and equipment perpetually damp. High temperatures combined with moisture created ideal conditions for tropical diseases, fungal infections, and skin disorders. Mosquitoes and insects were abundant, especially in swampy zones. Rough, overgrown terrain forced soldiers to move slowly, creating sustained psychological pressure. These hardships prevented American forces from fully leveraging their technological advantages. In contrast, the Viet Cong were intimately familiar with the terrain and used it to great effect. The dense canopy and undergrowth provided natural cover for guerrilla warfare. In these forests, Viet Cong units could conceal themselves, approach bases, lay traps, or launch ambushes with little risk of detection. Many American soldiers described the feeling of being constantly watched without ever knowing where the enemy was. There was no question. The jungle was a major obstacle for U.S. operations, and the military sought any means available to overcome it. On November 30th, 1961, President John Kennedy approved the use of herbicides in Vietnam under a program codenamed Ranch Hand. The operation had two primary objectives: to deny the enemy concealment provided by the vegetation, and to destroy crops that could support their war efforts. In 1962, the United States officially launched Operation Ranch Hand over South Vietnam. The main workhorse was the modified C-123 transport aircraft, fitted with large internal tanks and spray nozzles under the wings. When approaching target zones, the C-123s had to fly extremely low, just over 150 feet above the canopy, and at a slow speed of about 130 miles per hour, to ensure the herbicide formed a consistent mist behind the aircraft. A typical mission involved 3 to 5 C-123s flying in parallel formation. Each aircraft laid down a swath roughly 80 meters wide and more than 15 kilometers long. Together, they could cover vast areas in a single pass. The primary targets included the forests of eastern South Vietnam, the central highlands, coastal mangrove regions, and rice fields in the Mekong Delta. The goal was to expose supply routes and guerrilla operating areas. From early test missions, the program expanded rapidly as U.S. involvement deepened. After the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, spraying operations increased significantly. A detachment was stationed in Ja Nang to target routes along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Eventually, 5 air bases supported ranch hand operations. The year 1968 marked the peak of the program. Approximately 5,700 missions were flown, releasing more than 19 million liters of herbicides in that year alone. From 1962 to 1971, nearly 80 million liters were sprayed over South Vietnam. About 12 million gallons were Agent Orange. It is estimated that roughly one-fifth of South Vietnam's forested land was affected to varying degrees. Most missions were carried out by the 309th Air Commando Squadron, later redesignated the 12th Air Commando Squadron. These flights were extremely dangerous, flying low, slow, and straight made aircraft easy targets for ground fire. In areas such as War Zone D, the narrow terrain forced pilots into sharp, evasive maneuvers to avoid anti-aircraft fire, adding to the risk of accidents. In addition to the C-123s, some UH-1 helicopters were modified for spraying in tight areas, while ground units used trucks and handheld sprayers around bases. Several categories of herbicides known as agents were used. Agent Blue targeted rice and crops. Agents Green, Pink, and Purple were used early on, later replaced by Agent Orange and, to an extent, Agent White for defoliation. Agent Orange became the most widely deployed and ultimately the most notorious. Compared to agricultural use, the quantities deployed in ranch hand were enormous. In many regions, the same forest or farmland was sprayed repeatedly over several years, significantly increasing environmental accumulation, especially in soil, sediment, and vegetation. On paper, ranch hand was portrayed as a technical success. Aerial reconnaissance showed thinner forest canopy, improved visibility, and exposed trails and hideouts. Reports emphasized sortie counts, gallons dispersed, and acreage treated, but field realities were far more complex. Tropical winds and rains frequently carried the chemicals beyond planned targets, drifting onto rice fields, orchards, and populated areas. Local civilians received virtually no warnings or instructions on how to avoid exposure. Even American troops often marched, camped, or worked in freshly sprayed zones without understanding the long-term risks. Throughout the war, herbicide spraying was presented to the American public as a technical, non-lethal measure to protect troops by clearing vegetation. When journalists and some scientists raised questions about long-term health effects, the military's official position remained, "There is no conclusive evidence." As a result, ranch hand continued until it was terminated in 1971. Among the chemicals used in Operation Ranch Hand, the most effective and the most controversial was Agent Orange. It was not an entirely new weapon. Agent Orange was a mixture of two herbicides already widely used in American agriculture, 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T, originally intended to kill weeds in farmland. However, to meet wartime demand, factories had to produce 2,4,5-T at extremely high speed. The shortened manufacturing process generated a dangerous contaminant, TCDD, a form of dioxin considered one of the most toxic chemicals ever recorded. Even minute amounts could have long-lasting biological effects. Dioxin possessed properties that deeply concerned U.S. scientists at the time. It binds to fatty tissue, does not dissolve in water, and degrades very slowly. Once it enters soil, sediment, or living organisms, it can persist for decades. Laboratory studies showed severe birth defects in animals exposed to TCDD. Some engineers and chemists at manufacturing companies warned about this issue from the start. They urged slowing production to reduce dioxin levels, but doing so would have jeopardized delivery schedules. In a wartime environment, such warnings were quickly set aside. Concerns were not limited to the factories. By the mid-1960s, researchers at the National Institutes of Health and several U.S. universities submitted reports to the Department of Defense warning that large-scale herbicide use could cause irreversible biological damage. A few members of Congress also questioned early findings showing birth defects in laboratory animals. In 1969, after multiple independent studies confirmed the teratogenic risks of 2,4,5-T, the Department of Defense suspended its use within the United States pending safety review. But in Vietnam, because of operational pressures, spraying continued. The scientific warnings remained largely confined to internal reports. The name Agent Orange did not come from the color of the liquid, but from the orange stripe painted on the storage drums. To distinguish the chemicals, others were marked blue, white, pink, green, or purple. The orange striped drums held the mixture that ultimately became the most widely used. In essence, Agent Orange was simply an herbicide, but the high levels of TCDD formed during rushed production turned it into one of the most harmful chemicals ever used in warfare. During the war, most American servicemen understood herbicides merely as tools to clear paths and reduce jungle cover. No one explained dioxin or long-term health hazards. They were taught how to open the valves, maintain altitude, and identify targets, but not how to handle toxic chemicals safely. Protective gear was virtually non-existent. Pilots, mechanics, and ground crews handled the drums with bare hands, without gloves or masks. The chemicals soaked into their hair, skin, and clothing. Ground troops often marched through areas where the spray was still wet, with no warnings whatsoever. Some experienced rashes, headaches, fatigue, or respiratory problems during the war, but these were often dismissed as ordinary tropical illnesses. Those who refused spray missions were sometimes treated as insubordinate. After returning home, symptoms grew more serious. Tens of thousands of veterans developed cancers, liver disease, heart problems, neurological disorders, and reproductive issues. Birth defects appeared in their children. It took many years to gather enough evidence to force the government and chemical companies to recognize responsibility. For many veterans, this became a profound psychological wound. They felt deceived and abandoned after serving. In Vietnam, the impact was faster and more widespread. Heavily sprayed regions along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the Central Highlands, Quang Tri, Thua Thien Hue, or the mangroves of Sa Mau saw massive forest die-offs, infertile soil, and crop failure. Civilians received no warnings. They simply saw fields stop growing, livestock weaken, and children born with deformities. Dioxin does not break down quickly. It clings to soil, accumulates in sediment, and enters ponds and rivers. From there, it moves through the food chain: fish, shrimp, poultry, livestock, and eventually into human bodies. Hotspots such as the Da Nang, Bien Hoa, and Phu Cat air bases still require high-technology remediation today. Vietnamese sources estimate that about 3 million people were affected, including roughly 400,000 deaths or severe disabilities and around 500,000 children born with deformities in the years following the war. While exact numbers remain debated, the scale of the impact is undeniable. Many families have multiple generations affected. Today, Agent Orange has evolved beyond a military chemical. It has become a symbol, a reminder that decisions seen as technical or tactical can produce consequences far beyond their intended scope. For the Vietnamese, it represents children born bearing the scars of a war they never saw. For American veterans, it is a reminder that war can follow them home in medical records and family tragedies. For the environment, it marks landscapes that may take decades or even a century to recover. Although Operation Ranch Hand ended more than half a century ago, its story continues. Dioxin remains in certain areas. Cleanup efforts are still underway, and those affected are still living with its consequences. The legacy of this wartime decision extends far beyond a single generation.